This is not a story. This is a warning. Across America, there are places where the nightmares never end, and the truth is buried with the dead. Tonight, we open another door. Welcome to the American Nightmare.
Unit responding. Report of an individual wearing a costume, standing near a residential area. No movement observed. Subject appears to be just.
In the late fall through early winter of 2016, reports began surfacing across the United States of people dressed as clowns appearing in public spaces. At first, the incidents were treated as pranks, isolated sightings, costumes worn for attention, or humor taken too far. Most involved no interaction, no threats, no crimes, just figures standing still. But as the weeks passed, the reports continued, spanning different states, different environments, and different circumstances. What began as brief encounters slowly shifted in tone. Distance closed, time increased, and in at least 2 cases, someone did not come home. Authorities never issued a unified explanation. Many incidents were dismissed individually, never connected officially. In this episode, we will examine 5 of those reports, 5 incidents, 5 locations, all occurring within the same narrow window of time. What follows is not an explanation, but a reconstruction of how the sightings changed and what happened when they finally crossed a line. Cincinnati is an old city, not ancient, just layered. Brick laid on brick, generations stacked on top of one another. Streets worn smooth by repetition. It's the kind of place where odd details don't immediately register as threats, because history has already taught its residents how to ignore small disturbances. That's why the first report didn't stand out. The call came in during the early evening, just after sunset, when the city is still deciding what it's going to be for the night. A resident on a quiet side street mentioned a figure standing near a row of parked cars. The caller didn't describe any movement, no shouting, no threat. Just someone dressed as a clown, standing still beneath a streetlight that flickered the way old lights do when they're overdue for replacement. When asked if the individual was doing anything unusual, the caller hesitated. No, they said, just standing there. The dispatcher asked if the person had approached anyone. No. Asked if they were blocking traffic. No. Asked if there was any sign of danger. The caller paused again, then said, "I don't think so." Officers drove through the area later that night. By then, the figure was gone. No report was filed. In another part of the neighborhood, a different resident noticed something similar. This time it was in one of the narrow service alleys that cut behind the buildings. Spaces designed for trash bins and utility access. not for people to linger. From a second-story window, the resident could see the alley clearly. The walls were close, the ground uneven, the light dim and unreliable. At the far end stood a figure in costume, partially obscured by shadow. The resident watched for several seconds, waiting for movement. None came. Eventually, they looked away to reach for a phone. When they looked back, the alley was empty. No footsteps were heard. No doors opened. Nothing moved. Later that same week, from inside a small living room, another witness watched the street through the slats of a set of blinds. The figure was visible from the waist up, motionless, framed neatly beneath the glow of a street lamp. Cars passed. A bus went by. The figure did not react. Minutes passed. The witness waited for a gesture, for a wave, a step forward, some indication that the person knew they were being watched. None came. Eventually, the witness closed the blinds and returned to what they had been doing. When they checked again, the street was empty. The light flickered on, flickered off, and stabilized. In the days that followed, similar observations surfaced quietly. Not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to connect. Just remarks exchanged between neighbors, mentioned casually and then forgotten. Someone seen near a car, someone standing where no one usually stood. Someone there long enough to be noticed. No one was approached. No one was followed. No one was harmed. And in a city like Cincinnati, where unusual moments are absorbed and explained away, it was easy to assume this was nothing more than a person seeking attention, or a prank that lost interest in its own performance. The incidents were logged under non-threatening activity. No follow-up was requested. No pattern was noted. At the time, it was classified as exactly what it appeared to be: a sighting, nothing more. Bend, Oregon is the kind of place that looks calm enough to be a postcard. Mountains in the distance, pine trees standing like quiet witnesses, clean streets that feel planned, measured, an outdoors town that advertises peace the way other places advertise nightlife. But some towns have a second temperature, not in the air, in the people. Bend has always carried a strange undertow. Not the loud kind, not the kind you can point to and name. More like a shared restlessness. A place where everyone seems to be waiting for something, and no one agrees on what it is. If Portland is a fever dream that learned how to drive, Bend is the quieter cousin that smiles too long and watches you while you speak. That matters, because when the report started there, the reaction wasn't panic, it was recognition. The first sighting came from a residential block not far from a green belt. Wide streets, trimmed lawns, the kind of neighborhood where porch lights switch on like clockwork. A figure stood near the sidewalk, tall and slender, set back just enough to look like someone waiting for a ride. Only the costume ruined the illusion. A clown mask, long hair spilling out from behind it, clothing too dark for the setting, as if the figure had dressed for a different town entirely. A witness watched from inside, hand on the curtain, waiting for the moment the figure would wave or shift or do anything that confirmed it was human. It didn't. The witness later said the most unsettling detail wasn't the mask. It was the patience. By the time a patrol car rolled through, the figure had stepped out of sight. Not fleeing, just no longer visible. No commotion, no sign it had ever been there. The officer noted nothing more than unfounded. The next evening it happened again. Different street, same kind of neighborhood, same quiet geometry. Driveways, mailboxes, curb lines. A figure standing at a distance where a person could be mistaken for a shadow. Except shadows don't hold their posture that long. A teenager walking a dog reported passing the figure on the opposite side of the road. Later, they told a parent they could feel the clown's face turning as they walked past, as if the mask had followed them without moving. The parent called it nonsense. But the parent didn't sleep well that night. Over the next several days, more people saw it, not always in the same spot. That was the difference from Cincinnati. In Cincinnati, the figure appeared and disappeared like a rumor. In Bend, it stayed long enough to become part of the landscape. A jogger saw it near a trailhead in early morning fog. A woman driving home from a late shift saw it standing near a cul-de-sac just outside the reach of the street lamp. A couple returning from dinner saw it in a pocket of darkness between two houses, too close to private property to be dismissed as coincidence. Always the same behavior. No approach, no gesture, no voice. Just presence. And because Bend is Bend, the explanations came quickly, and none of them satisfied anyone. It was a prank. It was a dare. It was an art thing. It was some drifter trying to scare people for fun. Theories piled up the way they always do in places where people have time to theorize. But there was a detail that began to trouble the witnesses. The thing they all described in slightly different ways. It didn't look lost. It looked placed. Not wandering, not performing, not asking to be seen. Standing where it could be noticed, and where it could also slip away without being chased. Like someone who understood the map better than the people living on it. Later, when investigators and reporters tried to sort out what mattered and what didn't, they found that the Bend sightings had one defining trait: duration. This wasn't a figure that flashed into view and vanished immediately. It held its ground, long enough for people to question themselves, long enough for them to shut the blinds, long enough for them to wonder if calling someone would make it worse. By the end of the week, the sightings had shifted from odd to persistent. Not dangerous, at least not yet, but present in a way that began to feel territorial. And that's when the tone changed. Because in a town built on quiet routines and controlled outdoor beauty, the most frightening thing isn't an attack. It's the idea that something has arrived and decided it belongs there. It wasn't the first time Bend had felt out of sorts, but it may have been the first time the town realized it wasn't alone in that feeling. Gulfport, Mississippi sits low and open, stretched along the coast where the land never quite feels solid. Streets run long and flat. Neighborhoods bleed into one another without clear borders. At night, the air holds everything: sound, heat, breath, like it has nowhere else to put it. It's the kind of place where distance matters. That's why the first sighting in Gulfport felt different almost immediately. The report came from a small community park just after dusk. Earlier that evening, families had been there, children on the playground, voices carrying across the open space. By the time the witness arrived, the park had emptied. The lights were on, but the air had gone still in the way it does along the coast, heavy and unmoving. Near the edge of the playground, just beyond the reach of the brightest light, stood a figure. The clown wasn't centered. It wasn't posed. It stood slightly off to the side, as if it had chosen a place where it could see without being fully seen. The witness later said the mask looked pale under the lights, its features flattened by shadow. The body beneath it didn't sway. It didn't shift its weight. It simply stood there. The witness waited for it to step forward. It didn't. They waited for it to step back. It didn't. After several seconds, long enough to feel foolish for staring, the witness turned away and walked back toward their car. They didn't run. They didn't look back until the car door was closed and locked. The figure was still there. Later that week, another sighting was reported along a residential street not far from the shoreline. The road was long and straight, lit by evenly spaced streetlights that left pockets of darkness between them. A woman driving home noticed the figure standing beneath one of the lights, close enough to the curb to feel intentional. As she passed, she glanced sideways. The head was angled toward her, not moving, not following, just angled. She told herself it was coincidence, but she checked her rearview mirror anyway. The figure didn't move. It didn't wave. It didn't retreat. It watched. That detail, eye contact, or something close enough to feel like it, appeared again and again in Gulfport. Witnesses described the sensation differently. Some said the mask seemed turned toward them. Others said it felt like the figure knew exactly where they were. even when they tried not to look. In one account, a man taking out his trash froze halfway back to his door when he realized the clown was standing at the far end of the block. The distance should have felt safe. Instead, it felt measured, as if the space between them had been chosen deliberately. The man went inside and locked the door. He didn't check again. Unlike earlier sightings in other cities, the figure in Gulfport wasn't confined to one location. It appeared near places where people gathered and where they left. Playgrounds, street corners, empty lots at the edge of neighborhoods, always close enough to register as a presence, never close enough to force a reaction. No one reported being followed. No one reported being approached. But something had shifted. People began to change their routines. Walks were cut short. Children were called inside earlier than usual. Porch lights stayed on longer. Conversations drifted back to the same subject, spoken in low tones, as if saying it too loudly might invite attention. When local authorities reviewed the reports later, they noted the similarities. The posture, the stillness, the silence. But what stood out most was what Gulfport added to the pattern: awareness. This was the first location where witnesses didn't just report seeing a figure. They reported feeling seen. The clown wasn't hiding. It wasn't performing. It wasn't testing reactions. It was present in shared spaces, standing where lines of sight mattered, where movement could be tracked, where escape routes were obvious. It behaved less like an intruder and more like an observer. By the time the sightings slowed, no one could say exactly how many times it had appeared, only that it had been close enough, often enough, to change how the area felt. In hindsight, investigators would note that Gulfport marked a turning point, not because anything violent happened there, but because it was the first place where the distance closed. And whatever had been standing quietly in other cities now seemed to understand how near it could be, without crossing a line. Yet. Sioux City is the kind of place people pass through without meaning to remember. Wide roads, modest neighborhoods, long stretches where nothing asks for your attention. It sits where routes cross and separate again, a place built for movement, not permanence. That's what made the fourth incident feel ordinary at first. The initial report came from the edge of a residential area where the street lights thin out and the pavement gives way to open ground. It was late, but not unusually so. Traffic was light. The night carried no sense of urgency. Near the shoulder of the road stood a woman. She was dressed as a clown. The mask was different from earlier descriptions, softer in shape, pale in color, with dark openings around the eyes. Those who saw her said the most unsettling detail wasn't the costume itself, But what could be seen behind it? Eyes, watching steadily from behind the mask, unblinking as cars passed. She didn't flag anyone down. She didn't step into the road. She simply stood there, far enough from traffic to appear cautious, close enough to suggest she might need help. Several drivers noticed her and kept going. One did not. The man was a long-haul trucker passing through Sioux City on a routine route. He had stopped before for stranded motorists. It was part of the job. He would later be described as someone who didn't mind helping out. There was no indication he felt threatened when he slowed his vehicle and pulled over. No one witnessed what was said between them. From a distance, it appeared brief. The truck idled. The driver stepped down. The woman remained still. One nearby resident later said it looked less like an interaction and more like an exchange of information, directions perhaps, or a question asked and answered quietly. The truck pulled away a short time later. That was the last confirmed sighting of either of them together. The trucker failed to check in at his next scheduled stop. At first, this wasn't considered alarming. Delays happen. Routes change. But when hours passed with no contact, concern grew. Attempts to reach him went unanswered. By morning, the absence could no longer be explained away. Search efforts focused on the immediate area, then expanded outward. The roadside where the woman had been seen was examined carefully. There were no signs of a struggle, no debris, no clear indication that anything violent had occurred. The woman was gone. The truck was located later, abandoned several miles away, parked neatly off the road. The engine was cold. The doors were closed. Nothing inside appeared disturbed. Personal belongings were still present. There was no sign of the driver. As details emerged, investigators struggled to categorize the incident. It didn't fit the earlier sightings. This wasn't a figure observed at a distance or a presence that vanished when noticed. This involved a decision, one made calmly, without hesitation. Someone had stopped, and someone had not come back. Residents who lived nearby replayed the night in hindsight. They questioned why no one else had intervened, why no one had called it in sooner, why a woman standing alone hadn't felt immediately dangerous. But that was the point. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. No panic, no raised voices, no obvious threat. Just a quiet roadside and a figure that seemed to belong there, waiting. When authorities reviewed the case later, they noted how quickly the language around the incidents had changed. What had once been logged as sightings were now being referred to as events, interactions, situations requiring follow-up. This was the first time a report ended not with the disappearance of the figure, but with the disappearance of someone else. And for the first time, no one asked whether the clown had been real. They asked where the trucker had gone, and why no one had seen him leave. By the time the final incident occurred, the sightings had already begun to feel familiar, not predictable, but recognizable. The reports had slowed. The appearances were less frequent. In some areas, they had stopped entirely. For many, the assumption was simple. Whatever had been happening had moved on, or burned itself out. Billings, Montana felt far removed from the earlier locations. Wide land, long distances, places designed for movement, not lingering. The trucker had been on the road for hours when he pulled into the truck stop just outside town. It was late. Snow had begun to fall, not heavily, but enough to leave the pavement wet and reflective. The lot was mostly empty. A few trucks idled in the distance. No crowd, no noise beyond engines and wind. Routine. As he parked, he noticed a figure standing near the edge of the lot. A clown. Not moving, not approaching. Just standing there under the harsh glow of the lights. The distance felt sufficient. Uncomfortable, but manageable. The kind of thing a tired mind might question later and dismiss. The trucker locked his cab and walked inside to use the restroom, leaving the figure where it was. When he came back out, the lot hadn't changed, except for one thing. The clown was no longer near the edge of the property. It stood directly in front of his truck, blocking the driver's door. There was no sudden movement, no rush, no attempt to startle. The figure simply occupied the space where the trucker needed to be. For the first time in the series of reports, the distance had collapsed completely. The two stood facing one another under the lights, close enough now to remove any uncertainty, close enough to make retreat a decision, not a reflex. Witnesses would later describe the trucker as capable, solid, someone used to confrontation, not easily shaken. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't try to circle around the figure. Instead, the space between them tightened, not through speed, but through pressure. At one point, a detail was noted by investigators reviewing the scene. Something small, something easily missed. A spiked brass knuckle on the clown's right hand. It appeared once, long enough to understand the outcome. Then it was no longer relevant. What happened next was not captured on camera. There were no clear witnesses, no recorded struggle. Only the absence of sound and movement where there should have been both. The trucker's body was discovered later, face down in the lot. Snow had begun to settle across his back and shoulders. The ground beneath him was wet, darkened by melting ice and tire runoff. There were no obvious signs of a prolonged fight. His truck was gone. Authorities searched for explanations that fit within familiar frameworks. Theft, violence, disappearance. But none accounted for the sequence as it was reported. A man arrives. A figure is seen. Distance collapses. A body is found. And the vehicle used to arrive is no longer there. Unlike earlier incidents, there were no further sightings in the area afterward. No escalation. No repeat appearances. Whatever had stood in front of that truck did not linger. It did not remain to be seen. It moved on. In hindsight, investigators would later mark Billings as the final confirmed encounter. Not because it was the most violent, but because it was the first time the phenomenon stopped observing. and chose not to leave the way it arrived. Thank you for joining us this evening. We appreciate you taking the time to watch this report. If you found it worthwhile, please consider liking this video and subscribing for future investigations. Join us again next week, same time, same place, as we examine a situation that began quietly, escalated quickly, and ended exactly the way it shouldn't have. Only on American Nightmare.